Why is this couple smiling? Perhaps they found hope, meaning, and purpose in the book of Revelation. Nearly 2,000 years ago, a lonely man on a distant island received a remarkable vision. Some readers have been frightened by his vision, but many more have found in it the hope, meaning, and purpose they were looking for. And now, here are your hosts, Dr. John Pauline and Dr. Graham Bradford.
Hi, I'm John.
And I'm Graham.
And we welcome you to Revelation, Hope, Meaning, Purpose. Graham, we're now in Revelation chapter 17. Bring us up to date.
Okay, we're dealing here with Revelation chapter 17, and it's really like going back and identifying Babylon and what has been causing the problems. So here we have Babylon identified, and John, I think maybe we'll start off with your points that you have to, and then I'll finish up with some pictures.
Okay. Yeah. We have a backstory to all of this, as we learned in the previous program, that the backstory of chapters 16, 17, 18, and even to the end of the book is the fall of Babylon, which occurred in actual historical fact and is described as well as prophesied in the Old Testament. In that story, a general named Cyrus, who's also an emperor, he comes from the east of Babylon, and he dries up the Euphrates River. It's an engineering feat in the ancient world. The river's dry. His army goes under the walls of Babylon. That river passed through the city. So by drying up the river, army goes under the walls, conquers Babylon, frees Israel from captivity, and Israel goes on back home and builds Jerusalem. That backstory really governs everything that happens in chapters 15 through 22 of the book of Revelation, because you have an end-time Cyrus, Jesus Christ, at his coming, who dries up the end-time Euphrates, the political powers of the world, to conquer end-time Babylon, the religious powers of the world, which frees end-time Israel, the worldwide grouping of the saints, and the end result in the book of Revelation is a new Jerusalem.
So we're really following a principle of allowing the Bible to interpret itself, where we go back to the Old Testament stories of Israel and the land of Palestine, or Israel, the nation there. And the nations were mentioned north, south, east, and west. And this is used by John in Revelation to describe what is happening to the followers of Jesus. And as we go through, we can see a picture here of Babylon as it was in its heyday, and it was sitting on the river Euphrates. And this is the imagery used because it depended upon the river Euphrates to supply its nourishment and its protection. And our next picture will show you how the river actually was flowing through the city. It was famous for its Ishtar gates. And it was a beautiful city, and probably this is as good as you're going to get as an imagery to give us an idea how beautiful it was. But the city was very powerful. It dominated, held God's people captive within it. And Cyrus, as John said, came and delivered God's people. And the last night of Babylon, and we'll see now the handwriting on the wall, when Belshazzar had a feast, and he was defying the God of heaven. And this is another reason why our viewers need to understand Daniel, because this imagery comes from Daniel chapter 5. The last night of Babylon, when they were defying the God of heaven with their idolatry, is used by John in Revelation to describe what is happening at the end of the world. This is the language to describe what's going on. To Rome through the title of Babylon. And it is recognized that Rome, when they conquered a country, would take the gods of all different nations and put them in the pantheon. So Rome itself was very open for worshipping all gods. I guess they played it safe, John. They wanted to worship them all and you can't go wrong.
Yeah.
And I think if the Jews had an image of Jehovah or Yahweh, they would have put one up there too. But it is recognized that from Babylon through to Pergamum to Rome was a route whereby some of the ideas of Babylon finished up right in Rome itself. And now we're going to look at a clip coming from Pergamum to describe what happened. In John's day, there was a very famous library here, right here in Pergamos. In fact, they are the ones who invented parchment, and the word parchment comes from Pergamum. the word itself. And over here we have 2 layers of bricks which were there to give insulation to protect all their books. This was a very famous library which rivaled the one in Alexandria. In fact, it's now recognized that many of the ideas from Babylon came their way through to Pergamum and eventually across to Rome itself. It's like as if Pergamum is a bridge between the two. The Pergamans had a very friendly relationship with Rome. Rome never had to conquer this city. In fact, they wanted to have emperor worship here. And so it is a fact we find that this is a bridge between Babylon, Pergamum, through to Rome, so much so that John and others of his time could refer to Rome under the title of Babylon. Okay, I think that's fairly well understood, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think a point that it underlines for me, again, is how the book of Revelation really is God meeting people where they are. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood at that. The book of Revelation is not just a human attempt to talk about the original situation. God is at work in this book, and God is foreseeing the future. But the images he uses, the language he uses in this vision to John fits that time and place. Calling Rome Babylon just fits that time and place. And as we were walking in Pergamum, it reminded me of how this type of understanding came from Babylon to Rome. So the book of Revelation, once again, is very appropriate to its time and place. At the same time, God embedded in it information that's very important for us as we approach the end of time. So let's go to chapter 17. And I think in preparation for what we're going to do with this chapter, it's a good thing to go right to the end. Sometimes if you go to the end of a book, you kind of get the picture of the whole thing. So in chapter 17, verse 18, we see, in a way, a summary of what's going on in this chapter. The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. This is the sum and substance of the whole thing. There is a great city that rules over the kings of the earth. The great city in the book of Revelation is this idea of a dominating religious confederacy that controls even the political powers of the world. In much of the ancient world, religion and politics were so put together that you could say, in a sense, religion dominated the political sphere. We've seen over and over again how in the Middle Ages a similar regime was in place, at least during part of that time. At the end of time, very shocking thing, portrays the idea that a worldwide confederacy of religious institutions will somehow be placed in control of a world government. This is what the book of Revelation is pointing forward to. It's not a reality in the world today, but it is something that is coming according to the book of Revelation. So in chapter 17, verse 18, you basically have the image, if we could see that right now. The woman sits upon the beast. This is described as the religious authorities of the world dominating the political authorities of the world. That was true in John's day with the religions of Rome that so dominated the lives of the Christians and God's people, with the political power of Rome undergirding those religions to enforce the obedience that was so damaging to God's people. That occurred throughout history in various forms. At the end of time, this kind of worldwide unity, religion controlling politics, will occur again. So basically, what we have in chapter 17 is 18 verses in 2 parts. It begins with a vision. In verses 1 to 6, John sees a vision of this woman on the beast. Also, the woman is sitting on many waters. There is his vision part. Then, in verses 7 through 18, there's an explanation. It's very important to see the distinction. This happens frequently in Bible prophecy. In Daniel 2, for example, there is a vision of the history of the world in advance in the form of a statue or an idol. In Daniel 7, there's a similar vision of a series of beasts, and we've run into that a couple of times in this series of programs. In the vision, Daniel can go to the end of the world and come back. But in the explanation, he stays right in his time and place. This is an important principle. In chapter 17, we see this division between the vision and the explanation. That will be very important in the interpretation that we come to later on. When we return, we will come back to chapter 17, but now we're going to go verse by verse and see it in a little more detail after the break. Welcome back. We've been talking about Revelation 17. At first we talked about it in general terms in our last session. Now we want to get a bit more into the verse by verse detail. But before we do, I want to emphasize a couple of literary strategies that John has embedded in this part of the book. First of all, there's a gap between vision and interpretation. I mentioned that briefly just last time. The first part of this chapter is a vision, verses 1 to 6, and that will be the focus of our study on this occasion. The second part of the chapter, verses 7 through 18, that is an explanation that comes to John from an angel. And we'll be talking about that explanation in a couple of segments a little later on in this program. A second literary strategy I want to emphasize to you we find illustrated in verses 1 and 3 of Revelation 17. Let's look at chapter 17, verse 1 first. One of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits on many waters." Well, that's on the screen. Let me ask you a question. Does John actually see the prostitute sitting on the waters? No, he is told. So this vision begins with a comment, with an audition, as some scholars would say. John hears something as the vision opens up. Then look what happens in verse 3. The angel carried me away in the Spirit into a desert. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. We've mentioned this principle before. It's the principle of hearing and seeing. In verse 1, John hears there's a prostitute sitting on many waters, which we learned in an earlier program is the Euphrates River, representing the political powers of the world at the end of time. But in the narrative, in the story of John, there's a woman sitting on waters. Whether it's in a boat or whether she's simply sitting on it, that is not explained. He just hears that. When he looks, he sees not water, but a desert scene with the woman sitting on a 7-headed, 10-horned beast. That woman is the same in verses 1 and verses 3. That beast is another way of describing the Euphrates River. You see, John uses multiple images to describe the same thing. And when you begin to see that, some of this difficult material becomes a lot more clear. This book was intended to be understood, even though it is difficult for us. Let's go back to verse 1 now. With that introduction, let's take a closer look at what is happening here. The prostitute in this verse, first of all, is Babylon. We see that in verse 5, which we noticed in a previous program. So she is Babylon. The many waters in this verse are the Euphrates River. One of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute, Babylon, who sits on many waters, Euphrates River." As we've learned, Babylon represents worldwide religious authority at the end of time. Euphrates River is one of the ways John represents worldwide political authority at the end of time. So we have seen that there is worldwide religious authority, worldwide political authority, and then there's a third grouping, and that is the saints of God. This is probably not organized in any institutional sense, but rather the people of God from every religious background who are finding that if you're in living relationship with God, no matter what background you came from, if you are right with God, you're finding kindred spirit with people you never expected. you would be able to relate to. In a sense, it's a foretaste of heaven, you see, because in heaven, we're going to be living with people from every imaginable background. If we can't learn to get along here, we'll probably never get along there. Now, this woman, Babylon, is a religious figure. And we know that because in the end of chapter 17, she suffers the fate of burning. Now, people are quite familiar that sometimes in ancient times a penalty for adultery would be stoning to death. But that's not what happens. In this particular case, the woman is burned to death in her punishment. The explanation for this is in Leviticus 21, verse 9. If a priest's daughter defiles herself by becoming a prostitute, she disgraces her father. She must be burned in the fire. So there was a special punishment in the Levitical law for a priest's daughter who became a prostitute. The fate was different. Babylon in chapter 17, building on that imagery, is the daughter of a priest. In other words, she's a spiritual figure. Moving on to verse 2, we have an interesting combination. With her, the kings of the earth committed adultery. The inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries. So adultery and alcoholism become two models for how the political powers of the world get tied in to the religious authorities of the world. That's a shocking thing, but this is something that happened in the ancient world as well. This concept of adultery, I think, is explained by Dr. Larry Richards in a clip that we're going to see right now.
Okay.
The most serious threat to Christianity in the early centuries was called Gnosticism. Gnosticism comes from the Greek word for knowledge, and the Gnostics believed it was their knowledge of their identity that saved them. They actually believed that they were a part of deity. And in the mid-40s, about the same time the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, the Gnostic Gospels were also discovered. In those Gnostic Gospels, the portrayal of their teachings and behavior is rather bizarre. And it makes one wonder how in the world such a heresy could have been so attractive. And I think the background to that probably resides in the fact that there were Jewish Christian thinkers who looked at the world about them and wondered why in the world innocent people suffer, why babies die prematurely, why animals eat other animals. And they drew conclusions that the problem with human existence resides in the physical world. That's where all the problems are. And they concluded that evil then comes into existence from a God who created it all. In these Gnostic Gospels, one of the things that is so prominent is that the God of the Old Testament is blamed for everything. Not only has this God of the Old Testament created the material world, he has created the animal world, including human beings, male and female, the union of which produces more matter. So for them, this God of the Old Testament has tried to gain control of his creation by imposing commandments, restrictions on the creation. 10 Commandments, for example, with their prohibitions to a large extent. Most of them are negatively expressed. Were considered by the Gnostics to be imposed by the God of the Old Testament to restrict them from freedoms that they thought were theirs by virtue of their identity. So we find in early Christianity that one prominent characteristic of the adherents to Gnosticism was to defy the God of the Old Testament by blatantly breaking every commandment they could think of. And the commandment that was most frequently used to express this rebellion against the God of the Old Testament was sexual immorality, because it involved the body more than perhaps the others.
Well, that was pretty heavy stuff, but I think the point is that these are ideas that might well have been influencing the churches as they look at this material and try to understand it. I was thinking about this when we were in Ephesus. I want to show you a little bit of that too.
Okay.
According to a colleague of mine, Larry Richards, ancient Ephesus was a center of Gnosticism. So there's abundant evidence in many books written about 50 to 100 years after the time of John that Gnosticism played a major role in the ancient world. What is difficult is the fact in the first century, in the time of the New Testament, the evidence for Gnosticism is much more circumstantial. We're not quite so sure exactly how much of those second century ideas were already present in the first century. So sometimes people refer to Gnosticism in Bible times as Gnosticism with a little g, and then Gnosticism in the second century has a capital G, showing that it is much more developed, much more complete. John would clearly here in Ephesus have been reacting to the beginnings of some of these ideas, but how much of that was present, we're not sure. So you rebel in Gnosticism. The key thing, I think, for our purpose, you rebel against God through adultery. Babylon is in rebellion against God. She may be claiming to be godlike, claiming to speak for God, but she's actually in rebellion, and this adultery and this alcoholism is an example of that rebellion. Verse 3. Then the angel carried me away in the Spirit into a desert. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. There's that 7 heads and 10 horns again. Once again, we have a beast. In this case, the beast is clearly worldwide political power, which is serving for Babylon. Religion, at the end of time, will come into dominance of the political sphere. Just like in Roman days, you had the Temple of Trajan, you had the Temple of Domitian, you had temples of Hadrian and so on, various emperors, which showed how religion was mixed together with the political sphere. That's the situation you have here again at the end of time.
And this is the norm, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's normal to have religion dominating politics, and this is how Daniel got into trouble when he was in Babylon, and this is how it was through the Middle Ages, and the uniting of church and state really was led to the Dark Ages. So we're looking probably now at a time in history where it is significant that church and state are not normally united, therefore the woman is riding the beast. Yeah,
the picture here in Revelation is a picture that would be out of the norm for today's world, at least in most of the developed world today. We learn one more important thing about Babylon in verses 4 and 5. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet, was glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand, filled with abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. The title was written on the forehead, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. Here we have a description of this woman, and artists, of course, have in various ways tried to render this. This woman here, in many ways, is dressed like the high priest of ancient Israel. If you study the Old Testament, the high priest had saying written on his forehead, holiness to the Lord. He was dressed in purple and scarlet robes, was covered with many, many different jewels and precious stones. There's so many connections here. This woman is connected to the high priest of ancient Israel. And not only that, she is also connected to somebody else. Who is that, Graham?
Well, let's look at verse 6. Have a look at verse 6, and we'll read this here. And in verse 6 it says, I saw the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus. When I saw her, I was greatly astonished. And I guess, John, we would say here, well, why is he so astonished? Why is he so astonished?
Yeah.
Because I think the next image is going to show us why he's so astonished. Last time he saw a woman out in the desert, it was this woman. This was the followers of Jesus. But now out in the desert, he sees this woman has undergone a change. And here are the professed followers of Jesus at the end of time. And, how different.
Yeah.
How different it is. And so John is amazed, he's astonished that this could be the followers of Jesus and the Christian church. You know, it looks like the Christian church, but a change has taken place at the end of time. All right, we're going to follow this up after our break and see more of what is really happening here. Welcome back. And now John is going to carry on with his understanding as he shares with us of Revelation chapter 17.
We're coming to the next part here, Revelation 17 verses 7 to 18, which are an explanation of the vision that he has just had. The vision of the woman on the waters, the woman committing adultery with the kings of the earth, the prostitute sitting on the beast, and so forth. It's the same woman throughout. It's the same political entity throughout. The vision is portraying an end-time union of religious institutions and political, military, economic institutions. Something perhaps that has never completely happened before in Earth's history, a worldwide union of all of these things. Interestingly enough, we almost had a pre-play of that not too long ago. In the aftermath of September 11, 2001, the entire religious and political powers of the world were united in one purpose. That union is breaking up now, but for a short time, everybody was focused on a handful of people scattered around the world. And in many ways, that's the kind of scenario we see here. Events will precipitate a worldwide union of religion, worldwide union of political, military power, and they'll all be focused on one thing, the extermination of the ways and the people of God at that time. The shocking thing about it is this. As we study Babylon in the vision of verses 1 to 6, we see abundant evidence. It's a priest's daughter. It has the garments of the high priest. She's the counterpart of the pure woman of chapter 12. What John is seeing, what astonishes him so much, is this end-time religious entity is not going to be anti-Christian. It is going to have a Christian face. Simply to be affiliated with a Christian institution is no safety as you approach the end of time, because the reality is there'll be a worldwide union of institutions with a Christian face that will be the great threat to the work of God at the end of time. That's not something I want to make up, but that is something that the text compels us to.
And not just here, John, it seems there are other places also which can be developed the same way. Watch the Christian church as we get to the end of time, because John seems to be telling us in many ways, but this is very prominent, this one.
We don't want to be misunderstood. It isn't that John is saying that to be a Christian is worse than any other religion. He's simply being real with the way things are. The reality is, as you look through Christian history, when Christianity and political power get together, great damage can be done. Any Muslim will tell one that, because if you go back to the Middle Ages, you can see what happened at that time, the tremendous harm that came both ways when religion and politics got mixed together.
Bad mix.
It's a bad mix. At the end of time, that mix will be even more dangerous, is what these texts are telling us. So now John comes to the explanation of the vision, and frankly, folk, this is one of the two most difficult parts to understand in the book of Revelation. I once held a doctoral seminar with 5 students. They spent the entire quarter studying Revelation 17, 7 to 11, and concluded at the end of those 3 months that they were all less sure of where they were when they started. So we want to say, as we go through this, I'm going to give you what I think we do know about this text, but I think there's much about this text perhaps that will only become clear when these events actually work themselves out. So Graham, why don't you get us into the text, and we would start with Revelation 17, verse 8.
Sure, John, and I'm so glad you're here to work with this one for us. All right, I'm very happy to read the text anyway. Revelation 17 verse 8. The beast which you saw once was, now is not, and will come up out of the abyss and go to his destruction. The inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world, will be astonished when they see the beast, because he once was, now is not, and yet will come. Well,
So
John.
this beast comes up out of the abyss,
Right.
out of relative obscurity,
Yeah.
which reminds me of the beast of Revelation 13. It has one of its heads that is wounded to death, so it goes to obscurity,
Okay.
and then it is resurrected at the end of time to act once more.
Okay.
So you have here a connection there. Here is a beast coming up. In the past, all of the political powers of the world also had religious connections. The two were always together. This is something different. Here is a beast that represents political power to be united again with another character who represents religious power. So this is something new in the course of our history here toward the end of time, that religion and politics will once again unite. Our current situation, as you've said before, is relatively new in history, and it isn't going to last forever. Let's go to verses 9 and 10, where things get really dicey.
All right, you want me to read that again?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, verses 9 and 10. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come, but when he does come, he must remain for a little while.
You notice in this text that you have again multiple images for the same thing. The woman is sitting on 7 heads. The 7 heads are also 7 mountains. The 7 mountains are also 7 kings. You see, so he's using a variety of images to describe essentially political power in support of religious authority at the end of time. Now, some people have suggested, oh, this is the ancient city of Rome, because the ancient city of Rome is on 7 hills. Well, we can explore that idea. The ancient city of Rome is actually built on 7 hills, and hills and mountains can be the same word in the Greek, but in Revelation, these 7 mountains are not there at the same time. They are consecutive. In the text, we notice that these are consecutive. We have an illustration of that. The heads are consecutive in that 5 are past.
Right, fallen. Yeah,
Now
past,
remember,
yeah.
in an explanation, John is getting it in his time and place. 5 are past. In John's day, 5 of these Old Testament superpowers are already in his past. The current one, the 6th head, would be the Rome of John's day. And then the 7th head would be the Rome that is yet to come, which we have seen is associated with the Middle Ages. So we have these 7 heads. They are consecutive. That means this is not talking simply about ancient Rome. It's rather talking about the world's political powers that have always in the course of history been tied to religion, and so it will be the case at the end of time as well. Let's read verse 11.
Okay, I'll be happy to read verse 11. The beast which once was and now is not is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction.
Now things get really complicated. You see, because you have a 7-headed beast but has 8 heads. Because the bottom line is the 8th head will be a continuation of one of the 7. The first 6 of these heads, all gone. They're gone from history. They're no longer with us. Only the 7th is still around. And so in some way we find this 7th head comes back at the end of time as an 8th head, which will be this final beast. This final beast carrying the woman is the last final end of political power in support of religion. In other words, the book of Revelation is saying, when this comes, we know that we are at the very end of time. So we have an end time, worldwide, political and religious unity. As you have said before, intolerance will return.
That's how it's been for most human beings, and we think this is the norm, but it's not. The Bible is clearly telling us we're going to return to a situation really not unlike the Dark Ages. And best understood, of course, like all prophecy, when it comes to pass.
Exactly the shape it will take may not be clear at this moment.
I think, John, what you've done is good. You have stayed right with the text. You have not gone out there and tried to pull in ideas and superimpose them, which often people are tempted to do. Stay with the text. This is what it's saying, and then we will have to remain with the content with the fact best understood in more detail when it really comes to pass. All right, we're going to have a break now, and when we come back, we'll keep working with this one.
Welcome back. We are working our way through Revelation 17, and we have come to see that it portrays a worldwide religious political unity at the end of time. As we go to the end of the chapter, we get to see not only how things develop, but also how they end up. And that's the part, I think, that gets most people interested. How's it all going to turn out? Revelation 17 and verses 12 and 13 will get us on the way. The 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but who for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. They have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. Now, like its earlier versions, this beast has 7 heads and 10 horns. And earlier, John has explained, perhaps to his satisfaction, but we struggle with it a little bit, what those 7 heads are and how they are consecutive through history. Apparently, the 10 horns are not consecutive. According to the narrative here, these 10 horns all occur at the same time. And it's the time of that 8th head, which is a rebirth of the 7th head that was there at an earlier time. So we have here, at the end of time, the development. In a sense, this goes backward just a little bit from where the vision was, and it portrays the time when the worldwide political unity comes together. You see, you have 3 worldwide confederacies in Revelation 16 and 17. You have a worldwide confederacy of the saints, the faithful people of God, not particularly organized institutionally and so on, but in faith, reaching out to God and reaching out to each other. You also have a worldwide unity of religion, religious institutions who are in opposition to what Revelation calls the saints or the remnant. And then you have a worldwide unity of political power. That's the context for Revelation 17. Here we see how the political unity comes together. You have 10 horns. Each of them are called kings. In other words, these are major powers in the world. When they come together, when they unite, when they give their power to the beast becomes this worldwide political union. Who are these 10 powers? Certainly, that's one thing that we should watch for as we look ahead. We should not expect to really know them ahead of time, but I can think of 2 analogies in today's world. One of these would be NATO. Certainly, any military power who would want to control the world would have to include NATO. NATO by itself is far more powerful than all the political military powers of the rest of the world. Similarly, in the economic realm, there's a group called the G8, and this is the major economic powers of the world. If you want to control the economics of the world, you have to have the G8. You see, together they have economic power far exceeding all the other countries of the world combined. So there's a couple of examples. At the end of time, there's going to be a desire to pull together a worldwide political unity, but it doesn't happen until a major, powerful subgrouping of nations finally gives in and joins in the worldwide unity, and then you have a worldwide political unity. How does this whole thing end up, Graham?
All right, John, I appreciate your staying with the text. It's a temptation often to move away, but you're stuck right with it, and I appreciate that greatly. Revelation chapter 17 and verse 14, I think, is worth reading now as a follow-through. They will make war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will overcome them, because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers. So really, here is this war taking place again, which we saw earlier in Armageddon. And it's important to notice that with Jesus, when he comes literally, as stated in the Gospels, he comes with his angels. But in the language of symbolism, as we find here in Revelation, when Jesus goes to battle, he has his followers with him. And this gets back to the great controversy theme we've often spoken about, the military language to describe God's followers and those who are on God's side. You know, we are like his spiritual warriors. Those who live for at the end time are like 144,000 troops ready for battle. And this is a language of revelation to be taken, understood spiritually, of course, because the battle is spiritual. But this helps us to understand a little bit about Revelation 16:12, Armageddon, when we have the kings of the east, or literally kings from the land of the rising of the sun coming. These are the kings, because Christ's people are kings and priests. And when you accept Christ, you are a king and a priest. And so when Christ leads the armies of heaven, in Revelation 16:12, with the Battle of Armageddon, he leads the kings of the east. This is the language of symbolism. And then again in Revelation chapter 19, we find that Jesus comes riding on a white horse, leading the armies of heaven, and they are clothed in white raiment. We go back earlier in the chapter and we find that the followers of Jesus, called to the marriage feast, are given white raiment, which is their righteous deeds. And John, this is interesting, isn't it? The righteous deeds of God's followers who are faithful to him, God takes these deeds into battle. Every time we sacrifice on behalf of Christ, every good deed we do is a result of having received the gospel and the good news in Jesus. This is not legalism. We get our salvation by a free gift, don't we? Sure. And we respond with a love response. But these love responses grow out of having received salvation. God takes these into battle. I think that's exciting.
I can imagine, though, there might be a few of our viewers that might be a little bit tired of the military imagery at this point. And so I do want to point out that there's a second line of imagery in this part of Revelation, and that is actually a female imagery. And maybe God is showing it both ways so people can understand. Because the contrast is not just military. There's a contrast between, on the one hand, the prostitute, and on the other hand, the bride of Christ. You have a unity on the one hand, the prostitute riding the scarlet beast. And that is the union of institutional religion with the political military powers of the world. On the other side, you have the bride of Christ, the pure virgin bride, in contrast to the prostitute. And so these also are images encouraging us to faithfulness to God, not to seek other relationships outside of our relationship to God in Jesus Christ. How does this all end up? Verse 16 will take us there. Revelation 17, verse 16. The beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the prostitute. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. Here's the shocking end. This union between politics and religion doesn't last long. But eventually, the political and civil rulers of the world come to realize they've been duped. They've come to realize that rather than serving God, rather than serving Jesus Christ, in serving Babylon, they are actually serving the enemies of God. And when they come to realize that, the political powers of the world come to hate the prostitute, come to hate Babylon, and in the end, Babylon, the religious unity, is destroyed by the Euphrates River. The drying up of the Euphrates River in chapter 16:12 represents this turn of mind. You see, the enemy powers there in the plagues gradually come to realize they're fighting against God, but they still hope they can win. But when they see that Babylon is not going to win, that they've been deceived, that they're now on the losing side, they turn upon Babylon with fury. That's the symbolism of the drying up of the Euphrates. Here, it's described in more literal terms as the political powers of the world turning on Babylon and destroying her. But you know, there's somebody else
Yes, somebody else.
that's really in control.
Revelation chapter 17 and verse 17 is important here, isn't it? Revelation 17 verse 17 shows us how God is in control. For God has put it into their hearts to accomplish His purpose by agreeing to give the beast their power to rule until God's words are fulfilled. You know, John, I'm so thankful for that. On earth it won't appear that way.
Yeah.
It'll appear very grim and very dark, but this text is telling us that God is sovereign and He is Lord. And evil powers are given a measure of freedom, but God still is triumphant in the end. He gives them a chance, a short season, to express their ideas and their way, but it won't always be that way. And I'm thankful for that. Yeah.
That's right. So this brings us to something of a conclusion of the events in chapter 17. But after a break, we want to join Pamela and draw this program to its close. Welcome back now to our comfortable chairs and joining Pamela for her perspective on these things. We've been talking about Revelation 17, and you know, Pamela, this is probably one of the toughest chapters in the Bible to get something practical out of and really down-to-earth spirituality. But we've been thinking about this, and a story you told me the other day really cracked me up, and I think it might be useful to us here. But before we do that, let me just emphasize the fact that the union between worldwide religion and worldwide politics is one that's done under particular circumstances. The thing that brings these two powers together is in verse 2 of Revelation 17, and that is the kings of the earth commit adultery with the prostitute, and the people of the earth are drunken. In other words, they join in a drunken state. Now, Pamela, do people make really good decisions under the influence of alcohol?
No, they don't.
Do you have any experience with that?
Well, I know a story about a couple that made not very good decisions under the influence. What happened is they went out for the evening and to a bar, and they came home that evening and under the influence of alcohol, and the wife decided that she wanted to hide her money from her husband.
She was afraid he was going to go drink it off?
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose.
Yeah, and you know, she didn't want him to spend her money. So when he was not in the room, now this was a trailer house, so there wasn't a lot of places to hide the money. So she looked around and she thought, well, he'd never look in the oven. So she had a big handbag, and so she stuffed the whole thing in the oven. And then they fell into bed that night, and next morning she was a little bit chilly. So she goes over to the oven and turns the oven on, and forgetting what she had done the night before. So no time, they started smelling smoke, and the whole trailer house was all clouded, and they needed to get out of that trailer house and get some fresh air because they were choking on the smoke, and so they had to get that under control. And fortunately, there was nothing. They didn't lose their lives or anything, but
the drinking money was gone.
Yeah.
I guess you
They
could
might have
say.
been better off.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed that story, and I think that comes together here with the book of Revelation in the sense, and perhaps that can be a practical point for us. You don't make good decisions under the influence of alcohol. It just clouds everything. And at the end of time, there are so many people who will be making spiritual decisions in a cloud, not really understanding. The other image is the image of sexuality. A lot of decisions are made in the back seat of a car. And when that passion wears off, the results of those decisions you still have to live with, you see. So alcohol and illicit sexuality are two examples of things that get human beings into a situation where they make bad decisions. Now, the image there of the kings of the earth, in Revelation 17, they commit adultery with the prostitute. When people commit adultery, they both think that by that union, they're going to benefit from it. Oh yeah, you know, it'd be cool to be with this person and so on. But then when the passion wears off, they see the darker side. And quite often, when the passion wears off, people hate each other. And this is the image that you have in Revelation chapter 17. Under the passion of the moment, whether it's alcohol or whether it's illicit sexuality, we make decisions, we do things that later on we regret. And this is the image that at the end of the world, the entire world will be making very bad decisions based on clouded minds. That's the message of Revelation 17, that we want to keep our minds clear, our bodies as healthy as possible, so that as we face the little decisions every day, we'll make the choices that will lead us to the right side at the end.
Yes, I agree. And you know, the word Babylon means confusion. And when we look at this chapter, we think, well, this is tough stuff. And John has done an excellent job of going through and just staying with the text. Stay with the text. It'll be more clearly understood when it comes to pass. And we must resist that temptation to speculate and run ahead. And, you know, studying the Bible, there are some things which challenge us, some parts more difficult, but there are some parts which are crystal clear. And that is, give your life to Jesus, trust in Him, and He, through His Holy Spirit, will be your real teacher. And the Holy Spirit, when it works in our minds, we must keep our minds clear. We must keep our mind clear to study the Word of God, to understand God's will. And the things that matter most can be understood. And let me encourage you, keep your hold upon Christ, and don't be discouraged as you see some parts yet which still challenge us. There is enough there to tell us clearly what God's will is for our life. But keep studying, keep learning, keep growing, and keep watching our programs, won't you? Because there are more to come, and the one to come next, you know, you're invited to a wedding feast. You are guests, and you're also the bride. Now, that'll interest you, won't it? Really it will. Thank you for watching, and we'll look forward to meeting with you again at our next program.
If you've enjoyed this presentation on the Book of Revelation and would like more information, visit www.revelation.hope.meaning.purpose. You can purchase your own DVD set of this series or the booklets, which cover the content of each program.